Ahoy there, mateys! Ready to set sail on another historical voyage. Today, we're diving into the story of a ship that's like the maritime version of Methuselah. Seriously, this thing served for almost half a century.
That's quite the lifespan.
Yeah, we're talking about a vessel that spanned 2 world wars, saw empires rise and fall, proving that going down with the ship wasn't the only option.
Sounds intriguing.
I'm Hari, and this is Kimi, our expert for this deep dive.
Glad to be aboard.
And all thanks to you, dear listener, for sending in this fascinating article that piqued our curiosity about the SMS Niobe. I gotta say, her story is anything but ordinary.
It really is. To think a single ship can be like a thread through time, connecting different eras and witnessing such dramatic changes. And the SMS Niobe, which later became the Dalmasija and then Kataro, is a perfect example of that.
It really makes you think, Imagine all the things this one ship saw, from its early days in the German Kaiserliche Marine to its final moments in World War II. And what strikes me is how her design reflects the naval strategies of that time, almost like a snapshot of a pivotal moment in maritime history.
You're right. The fact that the Niobe was part of the Gazelle class, designed back in the late 1890s, well, it makes her even more interesting because these ships were meant to be incredibly versatile. Like, they could be part of fleet operations, but also handle colonial service.
So basically, the forerunners of the light cruisers that became so important in later naval warfare.
Exactly.
And from what I read in the article, the Niobe and her sister ships were designed with speed and firepower in mind,
Oh, definitely.
combining aspects of both cruisers and avisos.
Well, for our listeners who might not be familiar, avisos were those smaller, faster ships used mainly for scouting and dispatch duties.
Right. So by merging those features, they essentially created a ship that could wear many hats.
Yeah, engage enemy vessels, patrol distant colonies, adapt to different situations, a real multitasker of the seas.
A real jack of all trades. And it seems like the Niobe was quite the busy bee during her service in the German Navy, taking on a variety of roles and missions.
That she was. Think about it. She served as the flagship of torpedo boat flotillas, highlighting how important those smaller attack craft were becoming in naval strategy. And she even acted as a scout for the main fleet.
Providing valuable reconnaissance and intel, I bet.
Precisely. She was versatile and vital in different operational contexts.
Always on the move, adapting, evolving. It makes you wonder what it must have been like for the sailors on board witnessing these historical moments firsthand.
The article mentions her presence during Tsar Nicholas II's visit to Germany in 1901 and then the Venezuelan blockade in 1902. Maybe not direct combat roles, but still, she was there representing German naval power on the international stage.
It's fascinating how a ship can become a symbol, almost like a floating embassy, a testament to a nation's strength. And it's not just about the ship itself, it's about the people who served on her, the stories they could tell.
You're so right. And speaking of stories, some big names in German naval history like Reinhard Scheer and Franz von Hipper both served as commanders of the Niobe during this period.
And of course, they went on to play key roles in World War I, which, as we all know, changed everything. It's like the calm before the storm. And I'm curious to see how the Niobe's role changed when the world went to war.
Well, that's where we'll pick up next time, but I can tell you, her story takes some surprising turns.
Oh, I bet it does. So join us next time as we delve into the Niobe's wartime adventures and discover how this seemingly outdated ship continued to make her mark on history.
All right, so last time we left off with the Niobe on the eve of World War I. Kind of a pivotal moment, right?
Absolutely. A world on the brink of chaos, and in the midst of it all, this ship trying to find its place.
Exactly. But before we get into her wartime service, there's actually a pretty fascinating chapter that takes place right after Germany's defeat.
Oh, you mean the Treaty of Versailles and all those restrictions placed on their military? I remember reading about that.
Yep, that's the one. Germany's navy was severely limited, but they were allowed to keep a handful of older ships, and you guessed it, the Niobe was one of them.
Why would they want to hold on to what many considered an outdated vessel, especially after such a devastating loss?
Well, think about it. Their navy was decimated. Any ship they could keep, even an older one, represented a valuable asset, a symbol of their maritime heritage, maybe even a glimmer of hope for rebuilding their naval power in the future.
A reminder of past glory in a time of uncertainty. It's a powerful sentiment.
Definitely. But here's where things get really interesting. The Niobe story takes a bit of a detour, involving a change of ownership and a new chapter in her already long career.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more.
So picture this. The early 1920s, Germany's trying to find its footing after the war, and they decide to give the Niobe a makeover. modernized her with updated guns, added torpedo tubes, even gave her a snazzy new bow, almost like they were prepping her for a debutante ball.
A grand entrance back onto the world stage. But didn't the Treaty of Versailles have strict rules about what Germany could and couldn't do with their navy?
There's the rub. They weren't allowed to sell armed warships. So what did they do? Right before the sale, they disarmed her, stripped her of her weapons, effectively turning her back into a peaceful vessel, at least on paper.
A clever loophole, I must say. A bit of legal maneuvering to get around those pesky treaty restrictions.
It definitely shows their resourcefulness and perhaps a bit of a wink-wink, nudge-nudge approach to international diplomacy. But hey, it worked.
So who was the lucky buyer? Where did the Niobe, now disarmed and ready for a new adventure, end up?
Well, she set sail for the Adriatic Sea, becoming part of the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which later became Yugoslavia.
Wow, a new flag, a new name, and a journey to a completely different part of the world. What a change of scenery for our old girl. I wonder how she was received in her new home.
It must have been quite a sight, a former German warship arriving in a newly formed nation.
You have to wonder what the Yugoslav sailors thought, seeing this veteran of a recent enemy now sailing under their flag.
Right. And there's actually some debate about her armament during this period. Some sources say she was rearmed at some point. Others say she remained disarmed.
A bit of historical mystery, huh? Makes you wonder if it was intentional or just a matter of lost records.
Perhaps a bit of both. History often leaves us with more questions than answers.
Speaking of questions, I remember reading about the Dalmatija's copper hull plating. It seemed like such a small detail, but I had a feeling it was more significant than it appeared.
You're right. It's a great example of how these seemingly minor details can tell a bigger story. You see, Yugoslavia was a relatively new nation with limited naval infrastructure.
So they probably didn't have the facilities to regularly maintain their ships.
Exactly. And that copper plating was essential because it helped protect the hull from corrosion, especially in the saltwater environment of the Adriatic.
A stroke of luck, almost. The original German designers probably never imagined their ship would end up in a situation where this feature would be so crucial.
It's like she was unintentionally equipped for a challenge they couldn't have foreseen.
And I bet those Yugoslav sailors appreciated it. I mean, trying to maintain a fleet with limited resources must have been tough.
Absolutely. But you know what really struck me? The nickname the sailors gave her. Auntie Helen, or Tita Jela in Croatian.
Oh, that's so sweet. A sign of affection, almost like they saw her as this wise old matriarch guiding them through their naval training. I bet those sailors had some amazing stories about their time on board.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that beyond all the technical details and historical events, there's a human element to these stories, a whole world of individual experiences that often go untold.
And, as we know, history rarely allows for peaceful retirements, especially when the world is on the brink of another global conflict.
Right. The shadow of World War II was looming, and unfortunately for Auntie Helen and her Yugoslav crew, their twilight years were anything but peaceful.
A conflict that would dwarf even the horrors of World War I. What role did she play in this new, even more devastating war?
Well, when the Axis powers invaded Yugoslavia in April of 1941, the Dalmasija, or Auntie Helen as her crew affectionately called her, was thrown back into a conflict she was hardly prepared for.
Yeah, a ship designed for a different era, facing the realities of modern warfare. It must have been a daunting task.
Absolutely. Her days of leading the charge were over. Her main role during the invasion was as an anti-aircraft battery stationed in the Bay of Kotor. She was tasked with protecting other Yugoslav ships from Axis air attacks.
I can't imagine what that must have been like for those sailors, knowing that your ship, built for a different kind of fight, is now facing relentless air raids.
It must have been nerve-wracking, but they were determined. On the first day of the invasion, the Dalmasija engaged Axis aircraft that were attacking Yugoslav destroyers.
Her old 83.5 millimeter guns, probably not the ideal weapon for that situation.
You're right, not ideal, but they still played a role in defending their fellow ships. It speaks to the resilience of both the ship and her crew.
A testament to their courage and commitment, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
Sadly, the Yugoslav forces were eventually overwhelmed, and they were forced to surrender.
The turning point for the Dalmasija, and a moment that would have significant repercussions for her future. Where does she end up after the surrender? Back in German hands.
Exactly. It's a strange twist of fate, isn't it? She was captured by the Italians and renamed Cattaro.
From German flagship to Yugoslav training cruiser to a prize of war, It seems like she was constantly caught in the middle of these global power struggles.
It's like her journey reflects the turbulent history of the 20th century.
What did the Italians do with her? Was she pressed back into service or left to rust in some forgotten harbor?
They mainly used her for gunnery training and as a target ship.
That's kind of sad, isn't it? A ship that had once sailed with such purpose, now relegated to target practice.
It does make you think about the fickle nature of fate. But her story doesn't end there. When Italy surrendered to the Allies in 1943, the Katera's future became uncertain.
Another turning point in her long and winding journey. Who ended up controlling her after the Italian surrender?
Well, the historical record gets a bit murky here. Some sources say she was briefly transferred to the Croatian Navy, renamed Znaim, and used to escort convoys in the Adriatic.
So even in her final years, she was still involved in the conflict, caught between different factions and ideologies.
It's a reminder that history is often messy and complicated, full of conflicting accounts and perspectives. But one thing is certain, her final chapter was a tragic one.
What happened?
In December of 1943, while on an escort mission, the Niobe, as she was once again called, ran aground on the island of Silba.
A navigational error.
It seems so. Perhaps her age finally caught up with her, or maybe the wartime pressures played a role. Whatever the reason, she was stranded, vulnerable, and exposed to enemy attack.
I can only imagine the feeling of helplessness, watching your ship, your home at sea, run aground.
The Germans tried to free her, but their attempts failed. And the Allies, alerted by Yugoslav partisans, saw an opportunity to eliminate a threat.
A target of opportunity and a chance to strike a blow against the Axis.
On December 22nd, British motor torpedo boats launched an attack, and 2 torpedoes found their mark, sinking the Niobe.
A sad end to a ship that had endured so much, that had sailed under so many flags, and witnessed so much history.
It's a reminder that even the most enduring symbols of strength can eventually succumb to time and circumstance.
From her early days in the German Navy to her final moments in the Adriatic, the Niobe's story is a testament to the changing tides of history. It's a story of innovation, resilience, and ultimately loss. Her journey reflects the complexities of the 20th century, the rise and fall of empires, the evolution of naval technology, and the human cost of conflict.
And it reminds us that history isn't just about grand narratives and famous battles. It's also about the individual stories, the lives lived, and the legacies left behind.
Thank you, Kimmy, for guiding us through this incredible journey and sharing your expertise with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the past. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.